All right, everyone. Sorry I've been away for a while. I had some personal emotional issues that made it hard to concentrate on just about anything. And by the time I would get home from anything, I just generally feel like I had all the energy. But I'm back, and as you saw, I actually made my own intro. Nothing fancy. Just figured maybe that might be something to grab someone's attention with. But this video is a little bit differently because it's a follow up to my previous two. Um, it's involving the powers of energy manipulation and psychic abilities. I just seem to just forget about a few simple things, and um, I think it'd be kind of important to talk about them instead um, for for a little while before I move on to something else. And surprisingly, there will be some overlap with these powers, so that should make it a little bit easier. So, one thing I forgot to mention about energy powers is probably the ability to sense energy. And a lot of people always would say, "Oh, I can sense your aura, I can sense your aura," but you never know what exactly that means. But if you're talking about something like Dragon Ball, um, it seems like even when the Z fighters were at their weakest, they were still actually able to detect power levels from a decent way away. In fact, I think the first real mention of it was actually through Yamcha when he actually fought against um, Jackie Chun. It was like, oh, I can't sense his fighting energy. And does definitely seem like that's something always to bring up because it always seems like the Z fighters can turn their powers on enough and just kind of hide their powers. It's like they can still have some power, but they can bring it out more. And it definitely is a bit on the strange side if you're going to be able to say, this is what it's like to actually send something. They never really said, what exactly would it feel like. I mean, might as well be the equivalent of like how someone says, if this body part hurts, it's going to rain. Um, so, but that's really not as much. I mean, because you can say, you can maybe sense, a big thunderstorm is coming in, but if you have to find someone very specifically in a crowd that while their power level isn't too impressive, they do in fact have something a bit more distinguished than everyone else. So when I was actually kind of thinking about this thing, one thing I could kind of thought back was the actual Daredevil movie, and when you kind of saw what it was like for Daredevil to actually see everything, said to use his radar senses. And that could be a one way to actually describe, what he could be to actually sense something. If it's also, but if in this case, if it's something a bit more cosmic, like your third eye, in which maybe the world looks black and white, except for people of this, that actually have energy. So it's like a selective color feature for movies like The Spirit and Sin City. So in this case, you actually just see, everything starting to come into color, uh, and maybe that would show their energy. Anyone who's ever read the book The Giver or seen the movie, it said everyone else was apparently just seeing black and white unless you were, um, it said, the keeper of memories, or it said in some kind of capacity, because they actually made the fact that they made a deal about the fact that the main love interest Fiona actually has red hair, and the giver was all kind of teasing, said, "Yeah, I bet you know." To all the elders, he said, "Just love knowing what that her hair is not what people think it is." And then you would mention that throughout the early parts, instead of Jonas's like of the story, when Jonas would notice, like an apple changing and also saw people change, it was just seeing the color red. So maybe in this case, that's what you can use to distinguish. But I have something a bit different. Now, while in this case, you may say, you can feel like like, the cold shiver running down your spine with maybe bits of electricity, in which in this case, the colder it feels and the more it tingles, you know it's going to be something pretty bad. But, I actually think it's something, it's more of a something you could actually feel and actually hear more. And in this case, got me thinking about music, which in this case, um, if everyone's playing the exact same, instrument, that could be the most mundane, but you add something else in it or a different version of it that sounds very different. You never know, that might be something more distinguished. And it said, so, everyone pretty much knows what a saxophone is, but most people may not always be aware that Kenny G actually plays a soprano saxophone, which is actually a little bit higher. And then they also have like bass clarinets, which are these massive instruments about as tall as a bass saxophone. That has definitely a different sound. And then if you have something like a piccolo, that's a very high pitched one. And then you have someone right next to it, let's say right next to you, that's playing a bass flute, that's going to be a much lower sound. And in theory, is that I always say that there's a general amount of energy already around you, like a simple barrier, and all the normal stuff is right down here. But if something isn't normal, it's going to start going up. So in this case, anything below here, it's like your body has just naturally tuned it out. Just as in this case, you're not really meant to hear like your blood pumping throughout every part of your body, and it said, or hear, and it said the peristalsis of your, it said, of your organs, and that just simply just means it's mostly just your digestive system, basically, what keeps them moving. So in theory, maybe the stomach is possibly one of the least ones, but the idea is the fact that it's what keeps everything flowing. So so in this case, it's like, if you're trying to, find something particularly, it's like you tune out the rest of the sounds that are hardly much of anything, and then you realize, okay, here is, something that's else. It doesn't have to be, anything too complicated, but it might just be the equivalent of going outside and you're vaguely aware that there are snakes around you. In this case, maybe they're a bit active because it's summertime, so you might be able to actually, you probably just pick them up because they're a lot more active. Things like trees, rocks, mountains. They technically do have sounds, but it might as well be like the equivalent of infrasound. It's like it's so low that you're really not supposed to use it. So it almost like fate says, okay, if you need said here are some poisonous snakes. You might live in an area with like wolves or coyotes. I actually have bears in my area along with skunks, so it'd be kind of nice to actually avoid those. And in theory, is that if even if everyone is could be you know playing the same song, but there are different clefs that instruments have, like things like clarinets and flutes will have a treble clef, but things like a baritone, tubas, and trombones are actually instead are instead on a bass clef. And I've actually seen like two parts side by side, like one for a trombone and one for a baritone. They were playing it said different notes. So even if that's supposed to be there, if someone, like what everything's supposed to sound like, if you're a band person, we don't have like a bassoon in our band, and all of a sudden here comes one, you're gonna, kind of pay attention to it, almost as though they're wanting to try to strut their stuff. And one thing I definitely do, I said no, is the fact that just because an instrument like a tuba is meant to actually be low, that doesn't mean you can't actually put a lot more energy behind it to sound very different. In this case, if you're trying to actually be a proud marching band, that's one thing, and you also have the fact of you said, and just maybe the fact that you can't, maybe someone actually can just put a lot more and just decide to see how high they can go rather than just being the low amounts of it. It said low everything. And there's even things like soprano and alto clefs. So if you only know these are what you're supposed to hear, and then you hear something else, that would definitely would be how you would kind of would determine something. And just as in this case, if you're just a beginner, you don't really sound so good, but then you listen to like a massive orchestra, and they all seem to be like just in perfect harmony, that could also be something. Um, but I wouldn't always would say is that, energy has to be very specific, like in Dragon Ball Super, God Key is definitely one thing, but I always believe there's at least some base power that's on the surface, and just so the fact you would say, okay, these people are said are alive enough that you can sense them, but their absolute might would actually would be quite greater because kind of like I saw a video of this person holding a simple cube of aluminum, and it really wasn't all that much of an issue and was a bit larger. But something like tungsten, it was actually much heavier, harder to hold, but they looked identical. So in theory, you can maybe say, oh, okay, I can feel it, kind of, pushing down me, going through me at a strange set of frequency you're not familiar with. In this case, doesn't have to be super divine. It's just the fact that, yeah, we're actually just very old, and we've been around long enough. The fact that our power levels just keep rising and rising and rising. So that's one thing to consider. Now, in terms of seeing things like more or less of a psychic kind of issue, you could it could be very similar for that, but maybe in this case it's kind of like a weird echolocation where in this case you do have the actual field, going out there and like with Spider-Man's Spider Sense in the first movie, he was able to see multiple things before Flash Thompson tried to punch him. So in theory is that so in this case you would have some way to perceive the world fully around you, and people always say use your third eye. Who's to say that the third eye cannot see perfectly, like through other objects, or in this case whatever you would see right in front of you and what's immediately behind you, going to be impossible with some degree of looking, above you. So that's not exact. So in this case, you could definitely feel everything, and naturally, I would just say the people they would probably feel the most are other psychics because they always would have that release of everything. It's like, look at me, I can. It's one thing to just lift like a simple water bottle, but if you actually can lift something like a 10-gallon water tank with very little effort, that's going to definitely say be there. In this case, the psychic, said field around it just to move it around. That is definitely going to be give off its own energy. Um, and you can say so maybe if you can't actually you can feel it, but you can't actually see it unless you're a fellow psychic. So you could have some degree of a frequency issue with all of that, but it's not. But it but maybe it's a bit different, yeah, kind of like how once you like in this case, high school is not exactly like middle school, and then college definitely not like high school, depending upon what state you're in, because it kind of seems like if you go to a state with lower expectations, they pretty much kind of just repeat everything. It's like in this case, you're just one part of your schooling, essentially just repeat it. So everyone says, "Oh, wow, you're so smart." It's like, well, I've had little bit of time to actually think about it, but you could also would say that you can also but there can be some things thrown in. Um, it's kind of like trying to memorize every bit part of the heart, and in this case, little kids won't know something like the pericardium, that actually surrounds the heart, and the fact that it goes about exactly the exact process of how blood enters the heart and then exits, comes back. essentially said leaves the heart, full of oxygen, and then comes back without every. You just never know whatever it is, and you could probably also link some degree of hyper intelligence as a bit of an energy psychic abilities, but it has to be very specific. And they always say in the DC universe, look how smart, Mr. Terrific is. Like he's even able to outsmart Batman. But they never really, but they just, I think they kind of made him a little too woke in the fact that it's like, yeah, we have a black hero that's very intelligent, but also very physical. And I'm just waiting for the moment where it's like they scan him and, they do realize he's actually has some different energy in theory. And then if you want to actually talk about some degree of hyper intelligence, and actually seeing it, it would actually be something like shave, like a type of shaved ice. In this case, they actually had remember this very sour cherry one where it started off fairly pink at the top, but it was like really blood red at the bottom where everything is. So if you were to see that, pink, like a pink ore around them, that's definitely um, kind of normal. People always kind of picture the brains as pink, so you could say, but it's kind of gray. But so that's what it would do. But if there's like a thin layer of something dark, like in this case, someone just cut individual layers, and you actually would see like the perfect outline of something darker, that means they have something not exactly normal. Because I'm not saying that you couldn't be super said intelligent for a human, but if you basically can do things that seem almost impossible for someone other than highly autistic, that would be kind of strange because it's almost like saying, as in the movie Injustice, no one actually noticed that Mr. Terrific's tattoo on his chest was actually a fully functioning computer that could transform into a kind of like an escape pod that was actually able to safely get him out of a maximum prison located deep below the sea. And in this case, naturally, you would say like if all that energy is going through you, that's one thing, and you could say that the parents could have been very smart, so they could have passed that on. But if someone is just, but imagine both parents aren't. Okay, it's not like the idea of having, someone like you. So you don't really. So it's like with the fantastic instead of Mr. Fantastic Invisible Woman, their son Franklin is very intelligent because instead of very intelligent because both of his parents are. But if you were to have someone kind of instead of kind of just average everything, and it doesn't really, is not never really labeled as the brains of everything, and they find someone else that's in the same boat, and yet they have, some type of advanced intellect, whether or not it be linked to psychic potential is one thing, but it's like, how exactly does that even work? You try, and maybe if you do like a complicated DNA scan, they would say, we found this little part right here that governs intelligence, and it's different. Almost though like, hey, the parents were exposed to something. Like it might as well be the equivalent of actually saying that normally this would be someone like Stefan or Kel, because he actually wasn't nearly as smart as Steve Urkel. And they also kind of when they showed, what it'd be like if Steve was actually part of the Winslows. Yes, he did have the glasses, but they really didn't show him being, super super smart, or anything. But in theory, is that if this one little notch would be what turns you more into Steve Urkel, or at least in terms of intellect, I would say. I mean, you could still be on there, but it's like would say, um, if you see him with the glasses on, that's how you know he's the truly smart character, and maybe like more modest clothing. But if you start seeing someone, really fancy dressed, no glasses, you've sacrificed your intellect to look, amazing. Someone that can be proud, love that. But one thing I also did kind of remember, actually, another power that should be associated with psychic abilities was actually like some degree of superhuman speed. In Star Wars, they would say that Luke Skywalker mastered force speed, and they showed in the old Clone Wars series Mace Windu running pretty fast, in which it definitely does seem like they were able to be pretty good, but like they were essentially running downhill, but they never really show. But or like an Olympic person is like, yes, we can move, but what if it could be taken a little bit farther? In this case, what if essentially, when you try to run, you actually hover just a few inches off the ground like you're wearing some kind of roller skates, and you were really booking it because one person was actually able to run, said skate about 64 miles an hour, enough to actually run away from a cheetah, and it seems like you have those wheels that can resist the friction of the ground. That's one thing. So, and it could be almost like the idea of riding one of those old, very old timey bikes with a really big wheel in front. So, in this case, if you can find some kind of psychic version of that, it's almost like you're not actually running. It's like you have a giant pair of invisible legs allows you to move. And in terms of actually what I kind of mean about the bicycle, if anyone's ever seen, so when everyone's seen like Dash running in The Incredibles, the way he was kind of like hunched forward, like he was really kind of pounding, it definitely does look like he practically, was, you know, like riding a really fast bike, using. So, and it made it seem as though he could defy gravity by running up the walls and kind of floating on the water for a moment. And if you find some way of, moving not just fast, but also reduce the friction, there's no telling what could happen. In Ben 10 Accelerate, they normally would have shown him, when they show like the wheels that he has, yes, it allows him to move very quickly, but you've seen like versions where he's on his back and he has to kick something, or he's using his claws for something. So it's both the fact that he is fast and he has that way to defy friction to just um, escape everything. So you could say maybe like the Flash's Speed Force also could fit in that little range, but it's its own thing. It's like yes, it can be there, but maybe it's just adjacent. Think of it kind of like places like it said Miami and Fort Lauderdale, it said Orlando and Kissimmee, or yeah, various other famous it said cities with suburbs. So it's like it's close enough, but maybe there is something that would just say the suburbs are a little bit more manageable. So that would definitely be quite a bit of an energy in things. And yes, you can possibly have both energy and telekinetics flowing through you. I mean, look at Sith Lords. I mean, they have the ability to shoot lightning, but that's just essentially just amplifying, their own electrical currents. Might be using it, but it might as well just be some kind of weird equivalent of saying, yes, I can use this other energy that is visible, but it's what you don't see that could be a bit more potent. So I'll let you guys dwell on that, and I'll see you in the next video. Have a good one.